This is Making Stitches, and this week textile artist Janet Browne shares not just her creative journey, but how she documents actual journeys in fabric.
I couldn't dream of going on holiday without a sketchbook. And it may just be, I do very little. Sometimes I just write down words. I once did all the warning signs from, I think we were going to Scotland, and each of the warning signs had different little phrases on. Don't forget your seatbelt, and remember it's a crime to drink and drive, and all sorts of things all the way up. And I wrote every single one of these down, hoping at some point that I might use them in a piece of work. I haven't yet, but they're all tucked away, ready to be brought out at some point. So yeah, things are constantly catching my eye.
Hello and welcome to Making Stitches, and a special hello to any new listeners who've recently found Making Stitches. It's lovely to have your company. Now, after 2 episodes which were almost exclusively about crochet, we're turning our attention to textiles this time, and textile art in particular. Janet Browne is a textile artist who's based in Yorkshire and creates the most beautiful pieces of observational art, featuring journeys she's been on, as well as detailed pictures of townscapes, gardens and allotments. Janet has a background in education and grew up in a family which was very creative. She finds inspiration all around her, but like so many of us, she's seen her world shrink thanks to the pandemic, and that has had an impact on her work. We spoke at the end of last year, and she began by telling me exactly what it is she does.
I like to think of myself as a textile artist, or maybe an artist who works with textiles. And I'm particularly interested in mapping various journeys, places, townscapes, using hand-dyed fabrics and what I would regard quite quirky style based on sort of folk art and quite a naive style. I like to map familiar journeys, and the way I would go about doing that is by obviously doing the journey and taking little snapshot drawings and photographs and little references along the way, which I would then combine into a piece of work which is based on reality but is very much an interpretation of that journey. So it will have elements, but it will also have aspects which have been manipulated in order to fit the picture space and to make the thing hang together. Now, obviously, some of these journeys cover a long distance, sometimes from one end of the country to the other. So the amount of detail I'm able to include has to be very, very selective. And most of the journeys, however, are based around Yorkshire. And I guess 1 or 2 of the particular holiday spots that we've been to as well. But primarily I make maps, and in more recent times the spin-off from those maps, so if you like, picking out some of the details that particularly interest me, have evolved the work into looking much more at gardens, allotments and the wildlife that I see as I travel along these places, and to a degree some of the townscapes as well. So it's maps made out of hand-dyed fabric, a little bit of wadding to give a bit of surface texture, stitch, both machine and embroidery.
Now, Janet, looking at your work the first time, there was something quite childlike or illustrative about your work that reminded me of being a child. I don't know whether it was the books I'd read or the things I was exposed to at school, but there's something just so familiar and just comforting about your work.
Yes, I think I know what you mean. My bulk of my career, I guess, has been around education. I taught primary school and a little more latterly some special educational needs work. So a lot of that work was to do with children's drawings, to do with their art, and those were my particular interests in school, and I often was the lead teacher in those aspects of the curriculum. So consciously or unconsciously, it's hard to say, those children's drawings and the way children see the world have very much affected the way I produce my work. And I think the colours also come into play with, you know, that sort of bright, colourful way that children like to work. But I think regardless of that, I think it's the way I've always worked. I've always been very, very interested in colour, and my main art education was in the 70s, a long time ago now, but it was very much about colour. So that's extraordinarily important to my work. And people have told me, and it's probably true, that they have a certain humour to them, which again is a bit unconscious, but I just see little things that interest me. An example would be, recently I did a little map during the lockdown, and there were some ladies swimming in the river, which is quite unusual, but it would be that sort of detail that I would pick up on to include in one of my maps, rather than maybe a beautiful tree. But it would be that sort of human element, slightly quirky element that I'd like to pick up on within the work.
Well, I think that's what kind of brings it alive, isn't it? It's not just a plain observation. There's so much more within your work, so much more detail.
Yes, and that partly comes down to the way I work, because, as I said a little earlier, when I'm making the maps, it's impossible, if you're doing a long journey, to include every single detail that you see. I mean, it would be crazy to try and do that. So you've really got to decide what catches your eye to include, and it is those quirky things, and it may be the patterns of the landscape, and you then have to simplify that as well to make it so that it all hangs together. So that simplification also makes it, I think, have that childlike aspect. And also, the perspective is all over the place, and it's very flat, and we're looking down as if it's in plan, particularly the maps, and to an extent most of the gardens and allotment pieces. You're sort of looking at it in plan, which again simplifies it. And there's a lot of representation of larger things using a simple symbols. So a large flock of sheep, for instance, will be represented by maybe just 2 or 3 sheep, which are all the same source of sheep, but just gives a sense that this is where sheep are, without having to try and fit every single one in. Or, that would apply to other aspects of the work as well, trees and cars and houses as well.
So very much in the way that a map would be if you were to look at it normally.
Yes. And certainly when I first began working, I did do a lot of looking at Ordnance Survey maps, particularly the older style Ordnance Survey maps, because the symbols that are used in those I found quite interesting. And I think I've always found quite interesting, because you can say such a lot with a tiny symbol. You can show that here is a whole forest with just one tree, or here is a battlefield with just a very simple piece of design. And I like that, and I've lifted that idea and put that into the maps as well, which again adds to that simplification. But I've invented my own if you like, Ordnance Survey symbols, which occur throughout all the maps. Sheep I've already mentioned. Cows have a particular symbol. Some flowers and trees are done in a particular style that is common throughout all the work. So that also can be added to with pattern and design from stitches as well. So marshy ground, for instance, I use a particular style of stitch, or sometimes for roadways or hard surfaces, I nearly always put French knots in to suggest the hardness and the unevenness of that place. So there's lots of little invented symbols, as well as some of the ones that are directly from Ordnance Survey, which helps me to put the piece together without it becoming overly complex.
Do you find that when you're going out and about on a day-to-day basis that you're always spotting ideas that you want to incorporate in
Yes.
future things?
Yes, and it can be quite frustrating. I usually have a sketchbook, or at the very least a piece of paper and pencils about my person all the time in my bag, or whatever. Certainly going on holiday, I couldn't dream of going on holiday without a sketchbook. And it may just be, I do very little. Sometimes I just write down words. I once did all the warning signs from, I think we were going to Scotland, and each of the warning signs had different little phrases on. Don't forget your seatbelt, and remember it's a crime to drink and drive, and all sorts of things all the way up. And I wrote every single one of these down, hoping at some point that I might use them in a piece of work. I haven't yet, but they're all tucked away, ready to be brought out at some point when I've put together the idea that might work for those pieces of work. So yeah, things are constantly catching my eye, and part of the process of making work is trying to refine all those ideas into the ones that are really important and will work well in a piece of work. And lockdowns has been especially hard, I guess, for everybody, but because I haven't been able to travel as far as I would normally do. So the things I'm seeing are the very familiar things. So I'm trying to look at familiar things and try to look deeper into them and pick out things I may have not noticed before. So I'm having to look harder at ordinary things to find those aspects that are interesting. So it's had me thinking in a slightly different way. So the long journeys have gone for the time being, but the tiny little detail pieces are in now, because life has become much smaller in a sense, and my work's become much smaller, reflecting it.
How has the lockdown affected your work then, as far as your what you're producing?
Quite a lot. Normally we'd go on holiday or go on journeys quite a lot, and that would give me lots of information to make new pieces of work about new places, and we haven't been able to do that. So I've had to make work about the local environment and really about the local walks I've been able to do, many of which I've repeated over and over. I'm sure lots of people have done that. So that's where they're looking really carefully at the little things. So I've had to adapt, and things like my own garden, the local allotments, the sort of village houses and things have become now the research areas for my work. It's that I look at rather than the much wider world. So the garden in particular, I've done all sorts of different variations of that, and also my friends and relatives' gardens, because you spend most of your time talking to friends and relatives stood in their garden. So they've also become part of my work as well. But you met those people whose gardens I'm choosing to represent may not recognise them straight away, because again, I pick out the bits that I like, that interest me, and disregard some of other aspects. So that, and also the colour I change, I like to keep it bright. So if the shed's a sort of dirty brown, I'll maybe do it blue, because it needs to be blue in order to give the work the cheerfulness that the rest of the garden has.
Yeah.
So yes, it has changed it a lot, and it's been much, much harder to find inspiration. It's not come as easily. I've had to really work to do it. I've also done some flower pieces which I've never done before. When all the wildflowers were coming out, I made some maps of the wildflowers that I was seeing during the March, April and May, the early part of lockdown. So yes, different things appearing.
Have you found your work has helped you cope with going through lockdown?
Yes. I think without it, I dread to think, because just as going out for a walk, I think a lot of people have found going out for a walk you can change your mood, you can release some of the anxiety that you might be feeling. Going upstairs to my workroom and sitting down and just really immersing myself in making a piece of work, which I always find very relaxing at any time. But there's something about the sort of steady chug, chug, chug of the sewing machine and the normalness of doing that's been very reassuring, and it's sort of having a space where you can escape the news and everything else and just get on and do something and feel you've produced something positive at the end, instead of just a load of anxiety and worry. So yes, it's been tremendously important. I'm not sure how I'd be without it.
I don't think you're alone in that, though, Janet.
No, absolutely not. No.
Now, can I take you from our current situation right the way back to your childhood? Yes. Have you always been a crafty person?
Yes. I can't remember a time when I haven't done some drawing or making or producing something. And that would very much be to do with family influences, grandmas, parents that both knitted, sewed, made clothing. My dad in particular, because he was in the Navy, was very interested in stitching, which I think he did during the downtimes during the war. And that obviously has a big influence on me. And it's also the education I had. I was very fortunate that I had an education where drawing, painting, making, sewing, knitting, cooking was a really important part of the curriculum. I may be wrong, but I seem to remember we spent most afternoons doing some sort of practical activity. And that was absolutely fundamental in giving me a basis from a good starting point where I could work from. And even though I didn't come into making work in fabric until I was older, I was much more drawing and painting. Those skills that I learnt in my early years then became very, very important, and I could build on them at different points during my life. And I've always drawn, I've always been interested in I could never understand why people would prefer to write rather than draw or paint. And even when I wasn't able to produce my work because of children or my career, I've always continued to draw and observe and sketch, and have cupboards full of sketchbooks and drawings that just sit there. But it was just something I just always had to do, and it's only since my children have got older that I've been able to develop that into making work in the way I now do. And that's been, I'm not even sure I could have done it as a younger person. I think it's as you get older and you acquire all these skills, and then suddenly it all clicks together how it's going to work as a piece of art, that you're able then to make work. And I think for me, I almost needed all those life experiences to put into my work before I could really have a confidence to make work in the way I do now.
Oh, that's really interesting, actually. It's all come together, almost like
yes.
gathering the ingredients for a recipe together.
Exactly. Yes. The early experiences with my family and their sort of creative but practical skills, and then working with children and their view of the world, going to college and doing it was a teaching degree, but it had a very, very large element of art, so learning some more sort of formal skills. And then later in life I did do evening classes and agencies in textile design that sort of just tipped it into helping me then. Well, I was like a springboard then, as you say, putting all those ingredients together and thinking, oh yes, I know what I'm doing now. As if all that time I've been thinking, well, I don't know what I'm doing this for, but suddenly I thought, yes, I do know what I'm doing now, and I can do it. So yes, it feels almost like that it's taken time, but it had to, yes, in order to evolve.
Until you were ready.
Yeah, definitely.
You mentioned that you used hand-dyed cotton as well as
yes.
embroidery in your pieces. So you dye the cotton yourself, do you?
Yes, I buy dyes. I buy Procyon dyes, which I seldom use straight from the pot. I mix them, which is tricky because you can't really see the colour until it gets onto the fabric. So yes, I dye each fabric, and when I'm doing a major piece of work, like a very large map, for instance, I make the design and make the drawing of all those elements, those sketches and photographs and all the things. So I make the drawing that I'm going to work from, and usually I colour it in some way, either I paint it or use coloured crayons, and then look at those colours and then try and mix the dye colours for the fabrics to match. So it's quite tricky to get it just right. So I won't do every single colour, but because I will already have some colours that will work. But the important colours, like maybe the sea colour or the sand colour, that's really important to set that work in the right sort of place. I'll mix those, and then that also gives the piece of work a uniqueness, because I can't then mix that colour again. So I might make or try to make that piece of work again, but it won't be the same because the colours will be different. So every single piece of work is completely original. Even if I repeat a design, which I do occasionally, it's never quite the same because the mix of colours is never quite the same. So I then work on with this coloured cotton, but I also put a layer of wadding behind the coloured cotton to give stability to the fabric so it doesn't move around too much, but also to give a little bit of texture to it. And when I've made a design and done all the dyeing and got all the materials ready, the way I start the design is to trace the drawing and then work from the back. So I put the drawing onto the back of the work I'm going to do, and piece by piece stitch from the back around the drawing lines that I've made, that I've traced, and cut back the piece I've stitched before I then put the next piece in. So the larger piece of work will have thousands of tiny pieces. So they do take quite a long time to make. Take a long time to make. And then they're finished with hand stitch. And I always use very dark navy blue machine stitch, because I feel that echoes a pen line, because that goes back to my interest in drawing. And I like that graphic quality that you can get on the fabric with a dark line. So it's always a navy blue line, but the hand stitch will be any colours that I feel are right for that piece of work.
That's fascinating.
So yes, very time consuming.
But incredibly special, every piece being completely unique. Yes, and I am asked sometimes to repeat pieces of work. Someone will see a piece on the website which is sold. Could I make another one? Well, yes, I can. And I can make it very similar, but I can't bear to make it exactly the same. I always like to revisit that place and see what's changed and put the new details in. So 2 pieces of work are never the same. Even the tiniest pieces, which some of the very small pieces I might make, 2 or 3 of them, but they'll always be different because the colours will be different, the stitch might be slightly different, may put a different plant or a different colour shed or something. So yeah, every single piece is completely different. There's nothing that's mass produced in any way. It's all handmade and unique to that individual piece. Yeah, but that just, like I said before, that just makes it so much more special, doesn't it? So
yes,
everybody who has a piece of your work knows that there's no other piece like that anywhere else in the world.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And sometimes I think, oh dear, I'm making such a lot of work for myself, because there would be easier ways of making pieces of work. I could print onto the fabric and stitch onto it in that way, but it wouldn't be the same. It has to be as it is in order for it to work, for me at any rate. It has to be the way I make it, with the stitched edges and each individual piece. It has to be like that. And sometimes I very, very consciously make things extraordinarily complicated just to see if I can do it. Just to see if it's possible.
Making life hard for yourself.
Yeah, quite deliberately. I do, because if it's too easy, I don't feel it's earned its place. If you're going to make work, it's got to be, it's not got to be a struggle. You've got to have pleasure in making it, but it can't become monotonous. It's always got to have a little bit of challenge to it. And when it stops having a challenge, then I feel, in my work at any rate, it loses its edge, it loses something. So it's that challenge that I think helps to keep it fresh. Well, at least I hope so. But it's, I do like to push it really hard sometimes.
Well, we've talked about the past and the present, Janet. What about the future? Yes. What are your plans for next year and for your work?
Well, that's very difficult, isn't it, at this current time? Obviously, I hope that fairs and events will return, maybe mid-year next year or something, and that would be nice to get back into the world. But as far as making the work goes, it's really hard to say what I'm going to make next, because until I see it, I don't always know. I mean, I ideally want to make some more maps, because that is the thing that really interests me. I love making the maps. And all the other work I do, all the allotments, and I do birds and animals, they're just extras. It's almost like the map is the central thing, and then I might make a series of work that goes with it, like some nice allotments I saw, or an interesting group of birds that were there, or a town that was particularly good, and that might go around. I might make us extra pieces to go with that work, but there's always this central piece that usually is a map, and I haven't been able to do that over this last year. So I really want to get out and do some of those again. And they are a bit indulgent, because they may just be for me, and they may not always have a lot of interest for other people. But what I can get from them is all the extra bits, as I just said, allotments and animals and birds and things. But exactly what it will be, it's really difficult to say. I'm hoping that they may have a joyousness around them if this dreadful virus is overcome, and I hope somehow to reflect that in what I do. Quite how yet, I'm not sure. I mean, it may just be that everything will have more colour, more people in. Maybe it might be to do with people, and which I don't normally include many people in my work, but maybe that might be something that the joy of people might have to go into the work somehow or other, that we can be together as people again. So it's that sort of thing, but I'm not quite sure yet. I kind of know what I might want to do, taking part in events and getting work back out for people to see, but exactly what that will be is a little bit hard to say until I've experienced it. I'm not quite sure yet. Not quite sure.
I look forward to seeing what that will be when it finally comes.
Yes, when it finally comes. Yeah, that will be fantastic. And I'm sure there'll be many artists who are producing joyful work at that point.
I don't know about you, but I could listen to Janet speak about her work for hours. Thank you very much, Janet, for speaking to me for Making Stitches. I loved hearing about your creative process and where you find your inspiration, especially now all of us have found our worlds getting much smaller. Now, if you'd like to find out more about Janet and her beautiful work, if you haven't seen it yet, I really recommend you seeking it out. I'll include a link to Janet's website in the show notes for this episode. Thank you very much for listening to this, the 20th episode of Making Stitches. Now, since the podcast first started out last April, I have been blessed to have had the support of some truly lovely listeners and a wonderful community out there in cyberspace, and I'm really grateful for that. As I'm sure you're aware, we're facing lockdown here in the UK at the moment, and with that, my time has been consumed of late with homeschooling. Now, that's had a huge impact on how much free time I have for making stitches, so I've decided that as this is episode 20, it's a nice round number at which to take a short break. I promise I'll be back again in a few weeks' time, but I need just a little bit more time to fit recording in around my new job as teacher, which, incidentally, I'm not qualified for. Please make sure you're subscribed to Making Stitches on whatever podcast app or platform you use, and then when I do come back, the new episode will appear on your device and you won't miss it. You can also find and follow Making Stitches on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter, and I'll let you know on there when the next episode is coming out. That's all for this week. I'll be back again as soon as I can with another episode of Making Stitches for you, featuring another inspiring maker. My name's Lindsay and this podcast is recorded and edited by me. You can also find me on my blog, Postcard from Gibraltar. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, keep safe and enjoy your crafting.